I've been hiking on the Appalachian Trail for the better part of 30 years now, and I've had plenty of hair-raising run-ins that I don't care to repeat. I've come face to face with black bears and their cubs, which, as any experienced person will tell you, is about as close to staring death in the eyes as a hiker can get. I've had fishers running up trees next to my tent at night, which was very unsettling back when I was at an age when skinwalkers still raised the hair on the back of my neck. There was also one time I heard such a sickening crack when crossing a log bridge over a stretch of rushing river that I was convinced I was going to drown the next moment. But let me tell you, there ain't no kind of fear like the fear your fellow man can give you. And the Appalachians have a way of getting into people's heads that can be just as negative as it can be positive. I can tell you firsthand, once you get a taste for hiking, you really start to enjoy it. There's just nothing quite like being up there far away from civilization, relying on nothing but your wits and whatever you can carry on your back. The Appalachians change people. Like, you might have heard about the old tradition of taking a trail name, something like Bear or Sovereign or some other kind of nickname, as a way of expressing how you've left your old self back down in the lowlands, having ascended to a higher plane, both figuratively and literally. It's not just for aesthetic purposes either, folks. Every time you go out into the wilderness, a little bit of wilderness comes into you too. For some folks, namely city folks, that can be somewhat of a good thing. It opens your mind a bit, helps you better appreciate the simple things in life. You know, things you take for granted, like a warm, soft bed, or a good, readily available shower. For other folks, though, the Appalachians get into them in the same way a demon might possess someone's soul. It burns them up inside, burns everything good out of them until all that's left ain't fit to be called human. I've heard stories of people taking their own lives after particularly stressful hikes. They'd walk the whole trail over the course of the summer or fall, then just be unable to go back to their drab, tedious lives in the concrete jungles. I've heard plenty of other stories of folks losing their minds up in the hills too, before running into a group of less experienced hikers and killing them or something. I've never encountered any of that superstitious stuff myself, but I believe I almost did one time. And that's about as far as I ever want to get to one of them. This was way back in the late 90s, when I was doing some solo hiking up in Great Smoky. I was experienced enough to not have to stick to the trails and such, but not experienced enough to know that it's better to wait out approaching bad weather than to try and beat the skies. I thought taking a more direct route over the hills and through the forest would mean I could get a hot shower and hot chow quicker. As it turned out though, my arrogance meant I was caught in a hellish downpour. Experienced hikers will tell you that a hot sun might burn and blister your skin, but wet feet can really kill you. Wet feet for a long time means foot rot and fungus, and when you're relying on those feet to get you to food and shelter and away from potential dangers, not being able to rely on them can be a real death sentence. I knew enough to know that, so when the heavens suddenly opened up on me, I went running off to find myself some cover and waited out. In the end, I found it nearby, and it came in the form of what I thought was a shallow cave set into a rock face. At the time, I thought it was an actual godsend. I said a little prayer of thanks as I took off my wet clothes and swapped them for some dry ones. I was relieved to be out of that rain. Because of that, I didn't actually check how deep the cave went, not until I was fully dry again, getting bored from having to take shelter for so long. I took my flashlight out from my pack, switched it on, and then saw that this shallow cave went way further back than the daylight had led me to believe. Not only that, but it narrowed into a much smaller passageway that you'd have to get on your hands and knees to traverse. Now, I know what you're thinking. Who in their right mind would want to crawl down a narrow cave tunnel in the middle of the woods when you could just stay warm and dry and safe in the cave's opening while waiting for the rainstorm to pass? Then again, I imagine many of you have gathered that I have something of an adventurous streak, and after about an hour of just sitting there waiting for this rain to pass, I was about to go crazy with boredom. If there was something that could help me kill some time before getting back on the move again, you bet your butt I was going to do it. That's how I ended up creeping towards the opening to the tunnel, flashlight at the ready, and never would I have guessed in a million years what I was about to see. I figured I may see some of those awesome pointy hangy things, stalagmites or whatever they're called, but the first thing I saw when I poked my head through the other side made me immediately stop in my tracks. It was a single rock chamber, and the first thing I saw when I looked was signs of human habitation. There was clearly some kind of bedroll in there, incredibly filthy, but it was there all the same. Then, just as I was thinking about how someone must have been all kinds of smart and resourceful to use this place as shelter, I saw what was on the walls. Whoever had been sleeping there had scratched so many letters and words into the stone that I don't think there was a single inch of rock that was unscathed. I spent so long trying to decipher what this chicken scratch said that I didn't see the skulls lining the bottom of the cave walls at first. So many I couldn't even count them. It looked like they were from every kind of animal that called Appalachia home. I was incredibly nervous after seeing that, but my blood didn't fully run cold until I saw a skull that quite obviously belonged to a human being. I do know how a person could get their hands on such a skull, as there are many old burial sites around these parts. It's not out of the question that maybe they just found one to add to their collection, but as we all know, that's not the only way to get your hands on a human skull, and I definitely didn't want mine to be added to the collection lining the wall of that chamber. After that, I wasn't too keen on sticking around as I had been previously, and although it was raining like the deluge out there, I decided it was better to take my chances getting soaked than hang around and wait for whoever lived here to come back. Didn't exactly seem like the living abode of the kind of person that would appreciate the sudden appearance of a stranger, and by the way the bedroll looked, they'd been sleeping there quite recently too. I've been up to those parts of the Smokies since, but I've stuck to the trail since I found that cave. Anyone I bump into in that area, I always tell them to be very careful of strangers, even folks who seem kind-hearted and friendly such as myself, because like I said, the hills get into people's heads in a way that changes them, sometimes for better, but sometimes for worse. For a few summers back when I was a kid, I used to go to a summer camp in the Shenandoah National Park. This place is long gone by now, which is a real shame because I have a lot of happy memories of spending a week in the woods up there with some of my friends for the first few years. Before heading off to sleep, we do the stereotypical campgrounds thing of telling stories around the fire, playing flashlight tag, etc. This one year, though, the camp counselors had us playing this really weird game every so often. It was called Invisible, and the idea was that you run back to your cabin and either hide under the bunk beds or under your sleeping bag on the top bunk, whichever you were assigned to. Then, the counselors would inspect each cabin, and whichever had the most invisible kids got extra marshmallows or s'mores or whatever the after-dinner treat was that evening. I remember thinking it was a pretty weird game, and it definitely was not as fun as flashlight tag. But whatever it took to get the extra marshmallows, I was down for. We didn't play it so often that any of the kids complained or anything, and it did get kind of fun once we all got the hang of it. I remember the best part being the race back to the cabins, and how I was one of the fastest kids there, so I always made it back first. Obviously, that earned me a lot of praise from the camp counselors. We didn't find out why we were playing such a game until years after, when we were old enough to recognize just how weird that really was. Basically, a prisoner had somehow managed to escape the RSW Regional, which is the county jail over near Front Royale. Sheriff's deputies then figured out that the guy had then made his way up into the park because a bunch of food kept going missing from all these campgrounds. Obviously human theft too, not just bears being bears or something. The really scary thing is that the guy had been picked up initially for attempting to kidnap an elementary school girl after following her home from her bus stop. He'd tried it in broad daylight too, right in front of their chaperone guy. Just didn't seem to care, I guess, who saw him do it. Looking back, we were obviously at risk and stuff, but the people I really feel for were the counselors. Hearing that news must have made them sick with fear, knowing that there was an invisible threat to us just lurking out in the woods. Camp actually did end early that year for a lot of us kids. The parents came to pick them up whenever they were able, so it's not like they just kept us there in spite of the risk or whatever. They just had to think of something to keep us safe, while they organized getting us all out of there quickly. My dad said that the way some of the counselors looked, it was obvious they hadn't slept in days. They must have been keeping watch at night in shifts or something rather than having to wake up at normal hours to be extra vigilant where we did all of our regular activities, as to not give away that anything was wrong. This particular memory stands out to me because we really didn't know anything bad was happening during this. We were all just blissfully ignorant as to how much danger we were in, and then when camp ended early, we were all just bummed out about it. Our parents wouldn't tell us why it had ended, because no doubt it would have traumatized us. I mean, knowing we were in such danger for a while, and there was nothing we could do about it, other than practice how to run and hide, really makes you question what else was going on during our childhoods that was just a cover for something we were too young to handle at the time. You see, I'm a huge camping and hiking enthusiast, so one of the holy grails of my hobby has always been the Appalachian Trail. Unfortunately, I've never had the time to dedicate to hike the whole thing, so throughout the years, me and a few friends of mine visited certain sections of the trail for about a week or so at a time. We were based over in New Jersey, so we crossed Mount Mincy off our list fairly early. Then, the next year, we suffered through the part of the trail near Anthony's Nose that leads up to Camp Smith. Year after that, we conquered the 100-mile wilderness up in Maine. But then, in 2018, we decided to venture a little further south. We'd heard a lot of good things about the George Washington and Jefferson National Parks. They're some of the wildest sections of the trail, and now the parks are home to some really cool features, like the oldest fire lookout tower in the eastern US. The place I had my heart set on visiting, though, was an old ghost town called Lignite. You see, I'm really into ruins and abandoned places, things like that. I think I'd be more into urban exploration if the stories I've heard about it didn't put me off the idea entirely. See, the idea of getting to see an old ruined town like that is extremely appealing to me. In reality, though, venturing out near Lignite was probably one of the worst mistakes we'd ever come to make while on a hiking trip, and honestly, it's some kind of miracle that none of us were seriously hurt during. So, to cut to the chase here, we started out near Covington, then hiked our way down into the forest until we hit the trail. After that, we followed it about 20 miles or so up all these winding trails until we finally found Lignite. The whole hike took us about 9 hours, so as you can imagine, we were pretty exhausted by the time we arrived at this old ghost town. Instead of moving off to find more covered campsite for the night, we decided to just bed down near the ruins themselves so we could go explore them in the morning. There wasn't all that much to see, to be perfectly honest. Just some of the old foundations and a few crumbling chimney stacks. It was worth it to take a few pictures before we moved on down the trail, though. The next morning, we got up, and before we packed our stuff away, my buddy Joey and I decided to take a little stroll amongst the ruins. We were just meandering along, so kind of half asleep from the grueling hike the day before. Joey was taking the lead, while I followed along with my phone taking pictures. All of a sudden, though, my eyes darted towards something that Joey seemed to be walking toward while in blissful ignorance. I found myself reaching out to grab the back of his shirt, tugging him back to stop him from walking any further. Right there, hidden amongst the dead yellow grass, was an old rusted bear trap. At first, we were kind of amazed at what we were looking at. The thing looked like it could have been an antique, like it had been laying there for 100 years, just rusting away in the wilderness. Joey then tried to make out, jokingly I should add, that I'd basically saved him from nothing, and that he would have been kind of impressed if the thing even worked and clamped itself down around his leg, if he'd actually managed to stand on it. We debated with each other for a little bit over whether or not it was even still functioning, before picking up a few rocks and bits of old brick to toss at the small round trigger in the middle. It took a few tries, but in the end Joey managed it, and then, snap, we found ourselves recoiling in horror as the thing violently snapped shut. We both shared this kind of nervous laughter because it could have easily been a leg trapped in that thing if we'd stood on it. Although we were laughing, we were definitely pretty freaked out. It was only when we realized that there might be more of them hidden around here that we actually got much more serious. A threat dealt with was one thing, but a threat unknown was another thing entirely. We then very carefully made our way back to where we were camped out and told the other guys about the bear trap. We suggested we move someplace else, since there might be more of them out there in the grass or something. This guy Mike didn't believe us, thought we were playing a prank on him or something. He only realized we were serious when I showed him the picture on my phone. After that, we packed up our stuff and very carefully hiked out of the area, making sure to keep our eyes on the ground in front of us the whole way. We ended up walking around 5 miles west towards a place called Barber's Creek, hoping it would provide us a much safer campsite, as well as a source of fresh, clean water. It definitely provided us with one of those things, as there was a fast-flowing part of the river that allowed us to fill up our water bottles. Although it seemed fine and deserted to us at first though, we found something the next day that proved otherwise. One of our usual routines when deciding on where to camp would be to mark out an area for us to use as a bathroom. I won't gross you out with all the gory details of digging holes and whatnot, but it was a silent agreement to confine all our grumpies, as Johnny Depp so elegantly phrased it, to a certain area away from the campground to remain as hygienic as possible. Once the sun had set, we made ourselves some hot food over a fire, shared some bourbon Mike had brought along, and got ourselves some much-needed rest. We didn't hear any weird sounds moving in the darkness. We didn't hear any voices or sounds of metal or anything. The whole night was perfectly quiet and still, apart from a few crickets and cicadas. And that's why we found it extra creepy the next morning. When Mike got up and wandered off to the bathroom area, he found something that had him calling out to us through the trees. I remember waking up with a startle at the sound of panic in his voice, not knowing what the deal was. I could hear enough fear in his cry of, "You better come see this," to know that something was definitely wrong though. I pulled my shorts and boots on and joined the other 2 guys and rushed through the woods in the direction of Mike's voice. As soon as he came into view, he started shouting, "Don't run!" with this look of absolute terror on his face. We all froze, thinking he might be facing down a black bear or something, but the whole woods in front of him was completely clear. That's when he pointed to the ground in front of us. "This wasn't here yesterday, was it?" He was pointing at another rusty old bear trap, and no, it was definitely not there the day before. It was lying right where we'd all been walking to and from the bathroom area we'd designated, right out in the open too. We all agreed that whoever had put this there during the night was surely banking on one of us stepping on it during a nocturnal bathroom break. We had to repeat the process of being extremely careful where we stood as we trudged back towards our campground and packed up everything. We applied the same amount of care to where we stepped when making our way south, away from Barbara's Creek, towards a small town called Newcastle. We were in no mood to stay out on the trail, not after it had become painfully obvious that whoever had laid the bear trap initially had followed us all the way down to Barbara's Creek. It was a deeply unsettling realization that the bear trap we'd found at Lignite probably wasn't there by accident either. Like I said, given its condition, we figured it had been set years before our arrival, when by then, it seemed much more likely someone had set it down as we'd slept. Once we got to Newcastle, I made sure to call our find into the local cops, as just about anyone could accidentally walk on something hidden like that. God forbid if they were alone and didn't have a cell phone or something. When the question about who might have placed them came up, neither us nor the cops had any clue who might have done something like that. In fact, they found it quite weird that someone wouldn't cover the thing up with leaves or make any attempt to hide it, really. It was like whoever had laid it there wanted us to find it. More about sending a message than actually trying to maim one of us. We ended up catching a bus to completely throw whoever it was off our trail. There was a period where Mike didn't want us to carry on at all. He was freaked out by the idea of someone following us totally unseen. Not only that, but they were somehow able to lay the traps without making any noise. We found that intensely creepy all on its own, especially at night. Thankfully, we were not followed for the rest of the trip, not to our knowledge anyway. There were no further hidden traps near any of the other campsites. That didn't mean we didn't have some seriously sleepless nights for a few days, and the first night we got back out on the trail, we spent it all night sitting around a dead fire, shining our flashlights into the darkness, and scanning the woods for any signs of someone creeping around. It was only when we were 100% sure we weren't in any more real danger that we were able to get any decent sleep. But I think by that point, whoever had been laying those traps was confident we'd gotten the message to leave. So this happened a while back. I was probably around 10 or 11 years old, meaning my brother Alex was around 8 or 9. We were walking home from the bus, which takes about 7 minutes to do, when I noticed that something was off here. I didn't see anything at first, but I just could feel that something was wrong. My brother and I started walking home, as the only two who got off at our stop were he and I. This blue and silver beat-up truck drove past us. At first, I didn't think anything of it. It didn't stop or slow down or anything like that, just kept going on its way. Alex and I were holding our hands, as my grandmother had always told me to do with him. He's my baby brother, and I want to make sure he stays by my side to be safe. Nothing happened at first, but then the same truck came around again, driving our way this time. There was a cul-de-sac at the end of our road. It was driving much slower this way around, went up the road, and turned out of our sight. Alex and I were nearing the three-way intersection that connected the cul-de-sac road to the other road, right off the main road the man had just drove down. I happened to look down the street and see the truck driving real slow down the street towards us again. I knew at this moment we had to run. I knew there was no other option. If we didn't, my brother and I would not be safe. At the time, I didn't know how I knew. I just somehow did. As soon as we passed a house that blocked us from view, I turned to Alex and spoke to him exactly 4 words. No questions, just run. And we did. In our driveway, which was about 100 feet long, there was this row of bushes and pine trees that divided our home from our next-door neighbor. I grabbed my brother, dragged him in there, and told him to be quiet. I'd explain everything after the danger had passed. I watched as that same truck drove down and around the cul-de-sac again before coming to a stop right in front of our house. I had to hold my brother's mouth shut because he was crying at this point. I was scared that whoever was following us would hear him and find us. I was more worried about him than myself at this point. I was in fight or flight mode. I was the big sister, and I had to protect him. I looked at him and said that truck had been following us, and I told him he needed to be brave. I wouldn't let anyone hurt us, and that seemed to calm him down enough to stop crying. After what felt like hours, the truck door opened, and out stepped a man. He was tall, skinny, and messy, short hair covered by a torn-up baseball cap, ripped jean shorts, and a puke green tank top. He entered our yard and began searching around. Alex and I were still in the bushes. I was trying to find a way to get to our house safely without getting this man's attention. After what felt like another eternity, the man entered his car once again. He started it and drove away slowly. I waited a few minutes to make sure he was out of sight before turning to my brother. "We need to run when I count to 3. We're going to run behind the house to the back door, okay?" He agreed. We waited for a few more moments before I started counting. I didn't have a good feeling about this, but I knew we had to move. As soon as I hit 3, we booked it across our driveway into our front yard to go around the house. As soon as we left our spot, I heard it, the sound of accelerating. The man had seen us. He was waiting there for us to leave. He chased us up our driveway as we ran around the side. I grabbed Alex's hand and practically dragged him around the house. I made him run ahead to the garage door to see if it was locked while I searched for my house key. The garage door was open. I swear to God, I saw the man rounding the opposite corner of the house as we did, just as I entered the home. We entered and I slammed the door shut, locking it and deadbolting it. I didn't stop running until I opened the house door and ran downstairs with Alex, screaming our safe word. My grandmother had made a safe word for us for just this sort of situation. Just had to scream it basically and they'd know what was going on. It woke my aunt who worked the night shift and was sleeping. We told her everything and she stayed up with us until my grandmother got home. We called the police. That was my first ever interaction with an officer. The man was never caught though. To this day, we can't be sure what he wanted, but I know it certainly wasn't good. I'm glad my grandma drilled stranger danger into my head. I don't know where my brother or I would be right now if she hadn't done that.